Hello and welcome to the IBRS Thought Leaders panel. In this panel session, we've got Wissam, Mike and Alan who are going to be discussing the likely ramifications of COVID-19 on Australian IT budgets and what it means for the discerning CIO. So let's start off by talking about what do we think is going to happen with Australian ICT budgets. Mike, would you like to give us your thoughts to start with?
I think we can look at two components of this. One is the commercial and the other is government. And from a government perspective, there will be a natural tendency in a recession to try and reduce unnecessary costs. And from an IT perspective, that necessarily means to be questioned about what we're spending and why. In the commercial world, it's about how we can support increased revenue or sustainment of revenue with reduced costs.
Wissam, your thoughts?
Well, I think given that the budget will have a deficit, as was mentioned by the Treasurer last week, so we have to assume that it's going to impact the IT budget. And so that forces IT guys to refocus their activities. So I think they will be facing two alternatives. The first alternative is to focus on projects which improve business performance, and the second one and focus on projects which improve IT efficiency.
Now, IBRS published last month a paper that said during these times of downturn, we've had multiple downturns like this before with the GFC and others, but it's a real opportunity for CIOs to shine. There's actually a positive outcome that can happen from this adversity. Alan, what's your thoughts on that?
I think it'll force CFOs and CIOs, especially working together, to focus on discretionary and non-discretionary spending, working out what is discretionary and what can be curtailed for the moment, and then in the non-discretionary, how do we keep the business moving ahead but without compromising client service? And I think it's the client service aspect that will be predominant in the discussions with senior management.
So if we were to look at those discretionary, non-discretionary budgets and where we think that the market is going, both public and private sector, what do we think of the four big areas or the main things that our CIOs should be targeting?
Well, I think they'll look at all the projects and see if they can slow them down and cut discretionary spending, especially on contractors and consultants. Non-discretionary is very difficult because many contracts are tied up. It's very hard to change a contract, and if you try to do it, the vendors would probably resort to litigation. So that can be very time-consuming and probably not wise.
Mike, you made a comment earlier saying that you actually think that there will be a bit of a boom for contractors, at least in the government sector. What's your thoughts on that to counter what Alan has said?
I would raise 2 points. One, I think that governments particularly aren't going to change their emphasis on getting things done for the public, and as a result of that, even though they might be in recession and put a freeze on their staffing levels, the only way they can actually generate those outcomes is by having contract staff to do that work. I believe that there is room to go back to existing BAU contract vehicles and go, listen guys, we need you to tell us how we can do this smarter, and we need you to tell us what we are asking you to do that is not necessary or we don't think is necessary. So let's negotiate our position again. Keep your cost model the same, but just reduce our cost for using you. That's the option.
Now, Wissam, you've written a lot about as a service and contract management. What's your thoughts on this tension between going back to the vendors and asking them to sharpen their pencils, going back to them and looking at the more automation in the BAU space? How do you think that's going to work out?
It depends upon the life cycle of the contract. If the contract is close to be, if you like, finished, then vendors will be very interested to negotiate a deal before forcing the client to go back to the market and lose the deal. So that's important. However, if they are at the beginning of the contract, it'll be very difficult, if you like, to reduce prices. So maybe in this case, you need to focus on something else, like accelerate the use of cloud, for example, and allows them to reduce their cost without reducing their profit. implement more automation, for example, like virtual agents in the service desk, focus more on improving the process integration, and that's all will reduce the overall cost. I think based on my experience, I always found a good story to tell if the IT organization, in association with its vendors, communicate to the business there that our target is to reduce the business cost more than to reduce the IT cost. So if we can reduce the business cost in a justifiable way, while we need more money to improve IT, could be a sellable proposal.
It sounds to me that we're in a situation whereby the vendors will use this cost-cutting exercise, will use this, say, mid-contract to latter end of the contract, maybe a year coming up to end of contract, to work with the clients to try and negotiate more use of their technologies, deeper use of their technologies, but possibly at similar price points. Would that be something you expect to see?
Yeah, I think there are customers, if you like, who restructure their budget with the vendor. There is a core services which need to be delivered, and the cost of providing that service should be reduced than the traditional way because they need to improve efficiency. That's number one. The second thing is there is some amount of money which should disappear. In other words, it's no longer in the budget. That's cost saving. And they need to keep the third component of the money is for innovation. And within the innovation, the purpose there, as I mentioned before, is reduce the business cost while improving IT performance. And this combination of three, we became more efficient in delivering the core services. We saved the company money. At the same time, we still have money to invest in automation, artificial intelligence, all that stuff for the long term. Could be the working formula.
Right. So, Mike, you were going to say something around this. You've also got a fairly strong opinion on this as well, don't you?
I think particularly in the government space, there's a lot of opportunities to both talk to existing contract vehicles or companies that you have contracts with and to look at how you might automate services. But there's also a lot of hidden costs in the contract space that sometimes you don't really see until you go looking for it. And an example of that is in the government space, and commercially it would be very similar, is that they tend to have their office spaces on 10-year leases. And so there's 190 odd different government agencies in the federal government, and as a result of that, every year there's a significant number of agencies that relocate and change their location based on the fact that they're trying to get a better price for rent or a better neighbours figure in terms of the ability of the organisation to show that it's being climate friendly. But there's a cost to moving every time, and there's a cost to setting up and a cost to establishing those new services. Two things to that. One is if you can delay that lease changeover, you can extend the lease, you would actually save money for those couple of years that we're talking about. And the other point is when you do move, if you have to move, look at things like using Wi-Fi as your principal means of access in your new office space rather than cabling the office space. Looking at new next generation SDN and software-defined networking and smart switches that enable you to reduce your overall capital cost in implementation of the new site. So there's lots of little idiosyncrasies there that you can look at that most people wouldn't see because they tend to look at the big line items, which are projects related to IT. But relocation of property and enhancements or growth in office space all have those hidden IT costs and things that we need to look at.
Can I just make another point here? I think we've got to separate the tactical from the strategic. If I was a CFO and I've got a finance background, I'd be looking to the IT folk to tell me what's tactical and what's strategic. What can I do tomorrow to cut my expenses? And say, that's where I want you to focus at the moment because the CEO is forcing me to cut expenses and holding me accountable for it.
So what would be the quick wins then on the tactical side? I'll open this up to all of you.
On the tactical side, at this point in time, there might be a bit of a limitation on if you can reduce your headcount because of the job keeper, if you like, scheme. The government wants people to stay employed. So it's going to be unpopular for any CEO to go back and say, I'm going to reduce the headcount. So somehow they're gonna think in a different way. It's all about, if you like, the efficiency. Implement more automation in the whole thing, and that's what's gonna work. For example, if you take the IT service desk, if you implement the software agent, then you reduce the calls coming to the service desk. You need less people to handle it. At the same, the customer will get immediate response, and you improve the self-service, working from home, all that stuff. We need to look for efficiencies of that type.
What I think I would like to do as a CIO first up would be to do a number of collegiate engagements with my executive cohort to find out what the business hurt is and identify the impact analysis of changes to the IT infrastructure that might support it. And that needs to be done not in a defensive way, but in a proactive way. So if you're a CIO that finds you're getting impact analysis saying the world will end if we do this, then you're in the wrong place. What you need to do is say, this is the impact analysis and how we can actually make it work, and what we need to change to drive the change from the IT perspective to meet the business outcome. And that tends to be, I think, a little bit more successful than putting a moratorium on hires, because then you suddenly don't renew all your contractors. And hey, we had 10 contractors go last week. Damn it, they were the people doing the security patches for our software. Oh shit.
Yeah.
Maybe we won't say that in there.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. Give you an example of this. First of all, if you're going to do the deep BAU savings that Wissam's talking about, you're going to need entirely new skill sets that already exist. These are new tools, they're new mindsets, they're new tool sets. So either you'll need to retrain internally, which is an expense, or you'll need to hire new people in. Now, you might do that with consultants or whatever. So that's one area. But the other area is there is some real value, for example, taking a look at your maturity on software asset management, looking for optimization. It's well known that you can save, well, the industry states that you save about 30% if you do your software asset management well. My experience is it's more like 15 or 17%, but that's still a hefty saving when you consider how much we're spending on software. But you don't get that unless you are hiring people who have that expertise, or unless you're doing internal training. So this idea of cutting this, what you might think of the quick wins, low level stuff, is really dangerous. You need to come back. I think, Mike, what you're talking about is figure out what the organization's trajectory is and make sure you're appropriately hired for that. The downside of this could be potentially some of the skills that you've currently got are going to be forced to either evolve or move on. And I think that's a disruption that we are yet to see in the marketplace. What's your thoughts on that, Wissam? Because I know that you've done a bit of work in the space previously.
I think, given what Alan was requesting, that focus on the tactical things, the quick wins for the time being is the cloud. If you are an in-source type organization, go to infrastructure as a service. There is immediate cost saving. It's going to be cheaper. Most of the exercises I've done over the last few years, they came within that space. Infrastructure as a service, it saves you money straight away. And you could achieve it within 3 to 6 months, which is the migration from your in-house to, if you like, a public cloud or hybrid cloud or whatever you want to call it. So I recommend that's the first thing to be investigated, in addition to all the other things we were talking about, but that could be a quick winner if you get it correct.
Joe, one factor in all of this is the risk angle.
Every
change has got to consider the risk and its ramifications, and that needs to accompany any proposal to reduce expenditure. What's the consequences, and can I manage it?
Very, very, very appropriate. Yes, I think a lot of people miss that. Certainly, as we have rushed out to enable a response to the pandemic and the lockdown, we've created a lot of new risks. So I think it's not only looking at the risks or the ramifications that we are going to be making with cost cutting. There's still a whole bunch of risks that we haven't taken care of yet.
And not all of those risks are IT. Some of those risks are in fact human resource related and just straight security related. So we have a lot of people working from home. We have a lot of people sharing files or sharing information with collaboration platforms. And I think that that's been a reactive exercise. And coming back to the impact analysis exercise that I was talking about before, part of that is to determine risk. But there's also, I think, a number of lessons learnt from this pandemic that we should be saying, well, we currently do IT this way, but if the business model is going to change slightly and have more people working remotely, here's a better way that we could do it. Maybe we need to stop having video conferencing services under contract. We should be using collaboration platforms and just using the video that provides. Even though it's a lower quality video, do we actually need a high-cost video streaming system that's completely separate to our collaboration?
Pretty much what we've discovered with what we're using right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that, and I often quote the example of an organisation that had a price for bandwidth to run its services between its locations, a cost for its telephony because it ran a separate PABX platform that didn't use on-net telephone voice communications. It had 6 different collaboration platforms, and it had a separate video conferencing service that ran beside it. All of those things added up to a significant numbers of dollars, and they hadn't tested the market for their bandwidth in the last 6 years. And so when they tested the market for their bandwidth, they could quadruple their throughput for less than half the price. And that meant they could bring a whole lot of those services online. Coming back to Wissam's point, you have to spend money to save money, but they didn't have a cost for video conferencing. They didn't have a cost that was spread out over all of their different voice systems, and they had a single collaboration platform that enabled them to work better. So what's the outcome? Cheaper IT, better performance.
Yeah. Can I suggest that there is a sense of urgency in many organisations about this? If you're a CFO, you've got to give quick answers to the CEO and possibly the board. And that's going to occupy the minds of a lot of CIOs. How can I help my CFO in the short term to get some runs on the board? And yes, you're right, Mike, that is a strategic thing. And yes, it will achieve economies. But sometimes that's on the back burner. The immediate concern is, how do I save money tomorrow? And I think that's got to be in the thinking of everybody.
I agree. And one of the things that I was talking about the other day is a good manager, a good leader is always looking to have a reserve of capability, because they need to react to the unknown. And what's happened with the pandemic is that most of those resources that we had up our sleeve as CIOs have now been totally expended. So what we need to do as CIOs is think ahead of the game, to not have one plan, but have multiple plans, have contingencies in mind about how we could both improve services to the business, but also how we could reduce our own costs. So when we get a curveball that says cut by 12% or cut by 15%, then we go, oh, yeah, we can do that. Here's the impact analysis of doing it. Here's how we think we should implement that so we get the best bang for buck out of it. And this is how long it's going to take us to do it. So do some contingency planning. Think ahead of the game.
Yeah.
Option.
One of the things that happens when CIOs do start looking at how they're going to optimize, let's use that as the word rather than cost cutting, because it's a little bit friendlier and a little bit safer. When you look to optimize, often the discussion comes down to, should we do this internally? Should we do this externally? Insourcing versus outsourcing. This has come into very sharp relief at the moment with so many of the, for example, the Indian outsourcers absolutely ramping up to working from home. And we're seeing very different service levels emerging, but we're also seeing very different economies of scale emerging. So what's your thoughts on insourcing versus outsourcing?
Well, as a matter of fact, there isn't one perfect solution. The combination is the way to go. And of course, if you put everything in-house, you have better control, you have less risk. If you outsource everything, maybe you get the maximum cost reduction, but at the same time, as Alan said, you increase your own risk because you have to manage them. So the question is, you shouldn't outsource everything. You should outsource the area you are weak in. Where the areas you are strength, maybe the vendor won't do it better. And keep the ones in-house which you do well. And the one you don't do well, outsource it. So you end up with a hybrid Well,
But there's a real inherent risk here, because one of the things that we've seen with inquiries coming through is that there's been a lot of questions about degraded performance of these outsourced services. So if you're outsourcing the thing that you're not well in, and then you see, as a result of the pandemic and the infrastructure that's really struggling in overseas markets to support that outsourcing, we're seeing degraded services. You've now got your area of weakness becoming even weaker. So is there a danger here, and if so, what does that look like, and how would we mitigate against it?
well, it's all about the risk. So if you select the wrong vendor, bad contract, you're going to end up with a degraded service. So if you want to outsource, you're going to outsource the right thing. Number one, you want to outsource for the right reason. Number two, you need to select the right vendor. Three, and number four, you need, if you like, manage them properly. And number five, you need always to have the flexibility to change if things go wrong.
I would say the other thing is outsource commodities. If it's a commodity service, then that's safe to outsource.
But what I want to do is wrap up this discussion by saying, what are the top three pieces of advice that you'd each like to give a CIO that they should be looking to do right now? So I'll start with you, Alan, then we'll go to Wissam, and finally Mike. So Alan?
Well, I think as a CIO, you've got to identify your front or your client-facing services and your back-office services. And in many respects, it's the client-facing services that will get you the best kudos if you deliver them effectively. Back office, yes, it might suffer initially, but it's not so exposed. So if I was a CEO, I'd be saying, make sure you maintain client services to the present standard and don't compromise to meet expense constraints. Back office, let you have some leisure there.
And I'd like to point out with that one of the things which I think a lot of CIOs maybe have overlooked is that there's a huge amount of goodwill to the IT department right at the moment across the entire organisation, because in most cases, Australian organisations did a pretty good job of getting people working from home, and working from home in a way where people felt it might not have been perfect, but boy, it was a hell of a lot better. And I think that goodwill is that customer-facing aspect that you've talked about. Let's leverage that. Wissam, what's your thoughts on what CIOs should be doing right now?
I think the critical success factor for the moment is to achieve results quickly. And therefore, the strategy should be really focus on the things which really matter. Don't over-focus on 10, 15 initiatives. Pick up the top three. What's going to improve business performance, reduce the cost of doing business, and make IT efficient. And plan it on a 3 to 6 month. Because given the COVID ID, we still don't know how the new normal is going to evolve. So you better have this sort of mentality of focus and with flexibility to change things whenever we are forced to do it.
So to make sure I understand that, you're saying prioritize projects that have, say, a 3 month, no more than a 6 month period of completion, or break a project up into smaller pieces, and ones that will have a very tangible cost benefit to the business. Those should be your top priorities. So your big ERP replacement, maybe push that out a little way, because that's a bigger chunk of work. Yes?
Unless it is very critical to the business. So the criticality is what's going to decide more than what we think is right or wrong as an IT professional.
So the real skill there is being able to identify genuinely what is critical and trying to get it within that short period of time.
Exactly.
Brilliant. Okay. And Mike, what's your thoughts to sum up?
So I would agree with both Alan and with Sam, but I would say it in a slightly different way. One is take a lesson from the Prime Minister's book and establish a national cabinet with your business colleagues so that you can clearly understand the impact and the priority of effort from a business criticality point of view, not from an IT criticality point of view, but from a business criticality. The second thing I would say is look at your contingency planning for how you would support and establish a sustainable way of delivering those critical business outcomes, but also how you could potentially save money and do it smarter and better, and therefore help guide the business people to a better outcome for them that's a better outcome for you. And from a tactical point of view, I would review all of my contracts to see where I could potentially make savings, where it's in a contract that's been in place for a while, that they obviously want to keep the business, so you want to try and twist their arm, but also look at, you know, where there are areas where potentially you could come up with better ways to do it, like the collaboration platforms. That would mean you might change one contract to be slightly more expensive, but you would then get rid of 2 or 3 other contracts, which would save you money. So the cost benefit analysis is clearly there. So those are 3 things that I would say to a CIO to look at.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. This has been a fascinating conversation. I'm sure that there will be more in the future. For anyone who's listening in on this, IBRS is an advisory services company that focuses purely on the Australian-New Zealand market. We are experts in our field, and all of these comments have been regarding what's going on in a practical sense in the local market. If you're an IBRS client, please feel free to make an inquiry and continue this discussion, or have us help you explore your priorities, your needs, and how to navigate this very confusing and I think they call it in every press release, the uncertain times. But you know, things are changing. The good news is we have been through these before. Many of us have actually been CIOs or navigated pandemics, the SARS pandemic in Hong Kong and the Asia Pacific region, major economic downturns. So there are templates, there is experience out there, and you're not alone in that. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.